Hello, and welcome to the Academic Center for Writing presentation on the literary analysis technique known as Post-Colonialism. This presentation was written by Jason Schneider and is narrated by Scott Powers, writing specialists in the Academic Center for Writing. The approach of post-colonialism exposes the tension of a culture that is dominated by another culture. Subjects such as universality, difference, nationalism, resistance, ethnicity, religion, education, and history are commonly analyzed. There are debates about whether post-colonialism has a hyphen, but we will discuss it as far as clarifying that typically post-colonialism with a hyphen refers to a dominated culture that has emerged from its oppressors, and post-colonialism without the hyphen refers to a culture still under the dominant control of another culture. Within post-colonial theory, the dominant or privileged must be put into question in order to expose who is silenced and unprivileged because of the suppression the privileged imposes on the unprivileged. The privileged holds hegemony over the unprivileged. The control over a culture's ideology by the privileged is hegemony. Discourse is analyzed for whether a dominated culture has been silenced. Writers who come from an oppressed culture are marginalized as insignificant voices. These kinds of writers are called subaltern writers within post-colonialism and struggle to voice their feelings, concerns, and assumptions from a dominated culture's point of view. When we say the others, what is meant is that unprivileged people are treated with the pejorative attitude that they are different from white Westerners. White colonizers subjugate other people who are not white Westerners with demeaning connotations such as evil, subhuman, and savage, with their assumption that all other races are inferior. Alternity is the philosophical concept that describes this treatment of the unprivileged by privileged white Westerners. The colonized feels unhomeliness and acts with a double consciousness because the colonized are marginalized outside of both the colonizers and their own culture, which they might find familiar. As refugees between cultures, the colonized remain in ambivalence. Though post-colonialism is similar to deconstruction because analysis is done between the privileged and unprivileged, post-colonialism focuses on the subjugation of unprivileged people and their culture by white Westerners who had colonized and effaced others who were not white colonizers. Therefore, there is a binary pair of the privileged and unprivileged that post-colonialism exposes through analysis. So, using the post-colonialism vernacular, let's restate what post-colonialism does. Post-colonial analysis focuses on texts written from perspectives of subaltern writers of colonized or formerly colonized cultures. Furthermore, approaching a text with a lens adhering to post-colonialism as a form of literary analysis exposes what happens when two cultures clash and when one of them, with its accompanying ideology, empowers and deems itself superior to the other. Concerning post-colonial theory, three elements overlap and affect each other in significant ways and should not be overlooked in an analysis. Many of those who use a post-colonial approach analyze how each element affects one another. Furthermore, analyzing secondary sources in literary studies may well contain subjective and political interpretations in accordance with its time of publication and relevance to society during a particular period. Things to investigate include finding where colonialism's ideology promotes its purposes and hegemony, as well as where it might have been challenged. In addition, social, political, and economic concerns of the colonized and the colonizer must be considered. When analyzing post-colonial literature, we must consider how imperialism affects a person, their nation, and their world. Concerning aspects to consider for analysis, the historical, physical, and psychological, ideological, gender, and cultural aspects should all be examined. Winston Churchill has said that history is written by the victors, so textual history reveals the binary pair between the subject as oppressor and the object as the oppressed. Moreover, examining history, the ideology should be examined from whose perspective we receive a historical account. An examination of the physical and psychological aspects reveals mental manipulation and anguish the oppressed might endure from their oppressors. Other aspects we must consider for examination are gender, culture, ethnicity, race, and religion when analyzing the binary pair between subject and object. The first question from the subaltern writer lends information to his or her historical roots. The second question tells us information pertaining to tension between the subaltern writer's historical roots and the hegemony of the colonizer. From the third question, the information we learn about the subaltern writer is that the source of his or her tension lies somewhere between the writer's historical roots and the hegemony of the colonizer. Chinua Achebe is an example of a subaltern writer who was born in Nigeria. He went to London and later became an English teacher and writer. He wrote Things Fall Apart in English, but told about the heritage that aligns with his culture. Analyzing this text, the culture and religion of the colonized has been effaced and replaced with Western European culture and religion. The protagonist, who talks to Okonkwo, doesn't just blame the white man, but his own people too, for turning on their own people's culture and religion. Some key words from the texts that the protagonist mentions are that they were amused at his foolishness and allowed him to stay, as well as his own brothers who have taken up his religion also say that our customs are bad. Moreover, the protagonist mentions that the Nama's family has paid the white man for the land when the native ought to decide the owner of the dispute of land. This leaves the fault on the hinge between the colonizer and colonized. As a person, the protagonist doubts himself whether the colonizer is solely to blame, and the nation, by which we mean his people, has lost their identity once they had abandoned their culture, law, and religion for the white man's. This might be said as questioning where the protagonist's people stand and where their identity might be after the white man has imposed his imperial rule over the colonized. The people of the protagonist have adopted the white man's religion and law, whereas their native ways are abandoned. The text supports this, where the protagonist says that the white man's court, or law synonymously, decides and looms its justice over the colonized. Subaltern writers, just as the protagonist, question tension between the subaltern writer's historical roots and the hegemony of the colonizer. Ironically, the text states that it is the hegemony that holds the colonized together, yet simultaneously segregates the colonized. Therefore, the protagonist has a sense of unhomeliness because the roots of his culture are uprooted and supplanted with the colonizer's ways. As for the protagonist's people, we can gather from the text that they turn on their own because of a double consciousness they adopt when they cannot call their native ways theirs any longer, because the protagonist's people now live by the white man's ways. What happens in the text when the two cultures clash, when one sees itself as superior to another? Describe the two or more cultures exhibited in the text. What does each value? What does each reject? Who in the text is the other? Describe the worldviews of each of the cultures. What are the forms of resistance against colonial control? Demonstrate how the superior or privileged culture's hegemony affects the colonialized culture. How do the colonized people view themselves? Is there any change in this view by the end of the text? Describe the language of the two cultures. How are they alike? How are they different? Is the language of the dominant culture used as a form of oppression, suppression? Cite the various ways that the colonized culture is silenced. Are there any emergent forms of post-colonial identity after the departure of the colonizers? How did gender, race, or social class function in the colonial and post-colonial elements of the text? The next several slides present excerpts from Edgar Huntley and issues within post-colonialism analysis to consider with each excerpt. Read the texts carefully, looking for evidence in the text that relates to the questions posed. Let's try this one together. Read the text. The narrator is a European colonist named Edgar Huntley. One of the questions we can ask in order to begin post-colonialism analysis is, what happened after the European colonists settled on Indian land? Does the text indicate whether one sees itself as superior to another? Who in the text is the other? Describe the language of the two cultures. How are they alike? How are they different? Is the language of the dominant culture used as a form of oppression, suppression? Demonstrate how the superior or privileged culture's hegemony affects the colonialized culture. Thanks for watching. For questions about this or any other writing topic, come and visit the Academic Center for Writing in room W114. Thanks again.